მოგესალმებით, ქალბატონებო და ბატონებო, ჩემო ძვირფასო ტელემაყურებლებო. ვაგრძელებთ საავტორო გადაცემათა ციკლს საუბრები ჟურნალისტიკაზე, სიმართლე სიკეთით. დღევანდელი გადაცემის სტუმარია ჩვენი დიდი მეგობარი გაერთიანებული სამეფო და ტექნიკურ მეცნიერებათა დოქტორი, ბაკინგემის უნივერსიტეტის საპატიო პროფესორი, სამეცნიერო ჟურნალის, მათ შორის ინტერდისციპლინური, ორენოვანი, საერთაშორისო კვლევითი სამეცნიერო ჟურნალ ბრამსის სარედაქციო საბჭოს თავმჯდომარე ბატონი ჯერემი რამსდენი. ბატონ რამსდენს უკვე კარგად იცნობს ჩემი საავტორო გადაცემის მაყურებელი, საქართველოში მისი წინა ვიზიტის დროს მეტად საინტერესო და საქმიანი საუბრიდან მეცნიერების, განათლების, ბეჭდური მედიის პრობლემებზე, პოლიტიკისა და საერთაშორისო ვითარების მდგომარეობაზე თანამედროვე მსოფლიოში. ბატონი ჯერემი კვლავ საქართველოშია საქმიანი ვიზიტით და მიუხედავად შეხვედრებით, სამეცნიერო საქმიანობით, მასტერკლასებით, გადაწყვეტილი გრაფიკისა, ხალისით დათანხმდა ჩვენთან მორიგ ინტერვიუზე. მოგესალმებით, პროფესორ რამსდენ, დიდი მადლობა ჩვენს გადაცემაში სტუმრობისა და საინტერესო საუბრის პერსპექტივისთვის.
Well, thank you in turn for this invitation, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here again. People say that travel broadens the mind, and it seems only fair that the traveller should reciprocate by sharing some insight from his or her home country when he is travelling.
სამყარო თითქოს საყოველთაო არჩევნებმა მოიცვა. დიდ ბრიტანეთში ცხელი ზაფხული ჰქონდათ არჩევნების გაწამაწევის გამო. ამერიკის შეერთებულ შტატებში მღელვარე მოლოდინია მორიგი პრეზიდენტისა. ჩვენ პატარა საქართველოში ხომ საერთოდ არჩევნების მოლოდინის რეჟიმში ვცხოვრობთ. თქვენ როგორც მეცნიერი და პოლიტიკისგან მაინც შედარებით შორმდგომი ადამიანი, ამდენად მიუკერძოებელი მოქალაქე. როგორ ფიქრობთ, მაინც რა ფენომენია ეს არჩევნები? ღირს კი მის გამო ამდენი დავიდარება, ყველანაირი რესურსის, ფინანსურის, ინტელექტუალურის ბოლოს და ბოლოს პოლიტიკოსთა და მოქალაქეთა მოსახლეობის ნერვების ხარჯვა. განა რაიმეს არსებითად ცვლის არჩევნები ქვეყნის ერის ცხოვრებაში?
Well, of course, the first thought that comes to me is really Plato's idea of the philosopher king, which I firmly reject. And Clive Bell, who's in his rather excellent books on civilization, himself stresses that the most civilized members of society should not be its rulers. There is no reason for them to be its rulers. But of course, it's all very well saying who should not be the ruler. That begs the question, who should be the ruler? And what is ruling anyway? Now, when I try to answer this question, I think of some words from another scientist, one of my professors actually at Cambridge, A.B. Pippard, sometime Cavendish professor of physics. And he like me, he was not engaged politically, but in his excellent book, Response and Stability, he adds a few words at the end of some of the chapters on implications of unstable nonlinear systems. And one in particular strikes me as very relevant in the chapter about delayed feedback. Because if you have delayed feedback, if you respond to some change too quickly, then you simply make the system much more chaotic and much more unstable. And he observed that this is often what seems to happen in vote-driven politics, that the politicians anxious to secure votes rush to make some change in response to some event, and in fact, probably things would have corrected themselves anyway. They actually just end up making things much worse. We see this perhaps most clearly in the financial world, in the business of raising or lowering interest rates, but it applies to almost everything. So Pippard makes a plea for plain government, and we seem to see its best manifestation of that, I would suggest, in Switzerland, where we have a very low-key government that simply does what to me is the most important thing that the government should do, simply making sure that the conditions under which citizens can flourish in whatever they choose to do, following their own priorities, following their own lives, they can do it best without interference. So that should be the ideal.
Thank you. Demokratიის კრიზისი ისეთი ტრადიციული დემოკრატიის ქვეყნებშიც კი, როგორიცაა ამერიკა და ინგლისი, სახელზეა. აღარაფერს ვამბობ საქართველოზე, სადაც ყველა, ვისაც არ ეზარება ქვეყნის ბედიღვალზე გავლენის მოხდენას, ხელისუფლების ჭყალებში მართვას ცდილობს ქვეყნის შიგნით თუ გარედან. დემოკრატიას ხალხის მმართველობის მხოლოდ სახელწოდება შერჩა, არსი ხელიდან გაეცლება. კაცობრიობამ თავიდანვე იცოდა, რომ დემოკრატია სულაც არ არის იდეალური წყობა, მაგრამ უკეთესი ვერაფერი მოიფიქრეთ. ხომად დადგა დრო დაიწყოს მმართველობის ახალი, განსხვავებული ფორმების ძიება.
Well, this really follows directly from the last question, and perhaps I didn't fully answer your last question actually, because going back to the very notion of election, representative democracy, of course, implies inevitably elections, and once you've got elections, you've got all the problems associated with canvassing. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I did actually join an undergraduate student political association, and one of its rules was no canvassing for the officers of the society, the chairman and the secretary and so on. And this seems to be an excellent rule that it would be well to adopt for all elections. In other words, to be elected, you had to be known for what you've done for the association or for the party or for the country or whatever. Not engage in these rather meaningless speeches about what you're going to do, which of course you're not going to do anyway. They're all sort of empty promises. So it's all very well to have democracy, but there need to be flanking measures to make it effective, and one of those should be no canvassing is allowed, no advertising. You need to rely on what you've done, what you're known to have done for the best interests of the country. So that's one thing about elections, but turning now to the new question really about democracy more generally. And here, well, although everyone says, well, it's the best system, but remember that Churchill, I believe, said that it's the least worst system. So no one is really saying that it's a good system, but in fact, we can see many disadvantages apart from the actual mechanics of electing people that I just mentioned. But a rather good insight I found is in a book by Nicholson. It's a book about Lord Curzon, who in a way represented the old way of government. According to this old way, those in government simply acted for the ultimate interests of the country, of the nation. The trouble with democracy, we can call it the new way, which sort of was ushered in, after the First World War, let's say, in England, anyway, that one is always acting, the politicians are acting for the immediate interests of the country. They have to ensure votes at the next election. And this, of course, leads to a divergence, because the ultimate interests of the country are often very different from the immediate interests. And some other very good words are to be found in the writings of Beneš, who was Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia between the two world wars. And he writes really a scathing criticism of the flaws of democracy, particularly the slowness with which everything gets done, the endless sort of compromising and finding really a solution that satisfies no one in the end. And we can see all of these in play. If you look at the effects of foreign policy, particularly in Britain, British foreign policy, the outcomes, once it moved into the democratic phase following the First World War, were really very often not in the best interests, certainly not in the best ultimate interests of Britain at all. In fact, we practically walked, almost sleepwalked into a terrible, catastrophic war, the Second World War, because of these failings. So can it be remedied? Well, already the no canvassing rule may help to temper the excesses of some of those who come into office. And one might add that it should be a disqualification if someone is overly eager to occupy one of these great offices. And we see examples of that. In fact, the recent Prime Minister, Theresa May, was, when she was 12 years old, she was asked in school what would she like to be when she was grown up, and she said, I want to be Prime Minister. So she clearly had a long-standing ambition, but her rule was not actually very effective, not really good for the country.
როცა დამოუკიდებლობისთვის საბჭოური რეჟიმისგან თავის დაღწევისთვის ვიბრძოდით და უზარმაზარი მსხვერპლიც გაიღო პატარა საქართველო ამ მომწდამ ჭრილში, იმედი ჰქონდა, რომ 21 საუკუნის ცივილიზებული სამყარო პატივისცემით მოეკიდებოდა ჩვენსაც და ზოგადად ყოველი ერის დამოუკიდებლობის სურვილსა და უფლებას. როგორც ჩანს, ჯერ სამყარო ძალზე შორსაა ასეთი ჰუმანიზმისგან. საბჭოთა იმპერიის გრევის შემდგომ განვითარებულმა მოვლენებაც დაადასტურა და ამას დღევანდელი კოშმარით ცალსახად მოწმობს უკრაინასა თუ პალესტინა ისრაელის მაგალითზე. როგორ ფიქრობთ, ჯერ კიდევ შორსაა მსოფლიო მე-12 საუკუნეში რუსთაველის მიერ ნაოცნებარი ხადამგელი ერთად ზოვდეს პრინციპიდან სახელმწიფოთა შორის ურთიერთობაში დიდი იქნება თუ მცირე სახელმწიფო. კიდევ დიდხანს იბატონებს ძალის პოლიტიკა ჩვენს პლანეტაზე და იმეჯერი. როგორ ფიქრობთ?
Well, this is a very profound question, and I certainly very strongly uphold the right to self-determination. And we see so many problems that have arisen because of denial of this right. I don't think I even need to enumerate them. And not only unhappiness and misery, but also then extreme acts, terrorism from those who try to restore what they think is their natural right. Now, what is the solution? How can we make a meaningful change? Well, I would say that we even have the seeds of that in Europe, at any rate, in the shape of the European Union, because it only has meaning to me if the big nation states fall away, they wither away, they're really unnecessary. France, Italy, Germany, I mean, particularly Germany and Italy are only recently become sort of large unified countries. They are actually historically made up of much smaller entities. And that one of the main troubles in Europe today is the imbalance between the size of the countries. We have Germany, which is really dominating, and then we have many small countries which for one reason or another are often in a not very favourable situation. Now, of course, the EU is becoming increasingly unpopular, and to me, it would make sense to have a supranational organisation like the EU if it made the existence of some of these historic big countries redundant, so that their functions were taken over by the supranational body, and every entity then under that supranational body was more or less the same size. So we have, for example, Bavaria. I believe Bavaria anyway has its own offices in Brussels even now, and that would be one of the biggest countries. There would not be great differences then between these regions, or whatever you want to call them. That would give a possible meaning to an entity like the EU, rather than imposing a centralized direction on many areas of life, which actually do not even concern anyone beyond the private citizen.
ცოტა სასიამოვნო თემაზე მინდა რომ გადავერთოთ. სამეფო ოჯახი გაერთიანებული სამეფოს სიამაყე და დიდი იმედიც არის. შურიდან ასე ჩანს. საქართველოში ბევრი შემოქმნატრი და მათ შორის მეც და ვოცნებობთ მონარქიის აღდგენაზე, ჩვენი უძველესი მონარქიის აღდგენაზე. თუმცა სკეპტიკოსებიც ყავს და ისინი ფიქრობენ, რომ ეს გამოიწვევს გარკვეულ სოციალურ უთანასწორობას, უსამართლობას შეუწყობს ხელს, გაჩნდება პრივილეგირებული გვარები, კლანები. სხვანი ფიქრობენ, რომ ამ ისედაც შეჭირებულ, მატერიალურად შეჭირებულ ქვეყანაში არ არის გამართლებული სამეფო ოჯახზე გაწეული დამატებითი ხარჯები. თქვენი მოსაზრება ამ ინსტიტუტსა და მის პერსპექტივებზე ბრიტანეთში, ასევე კონსტიტუციური მონარქიის ალბათობაზე საქართველოში, რომელთანაც თქვენ მჭიდრო საქმიანი ურთიერთობა გაქვთ 10 წლებია და საკმაოდ კარგადაც იცნობთ ჩვენს ქვეყანას მის თავისებურებას.
Well, I have caught some views about the idea of restoring the monarchy in Georgia. A fascinating question. Now, I partly grew up in Switzerland, and in Switzerland the idea of a royal family is sort of faintly ridiculous, and I fully acknowledge the great international prestige of the late Queen Elizabeth II, and she was a strictly constitutional monarch, but on the whole, I find the monarchy not really an institution of our day. I well remember that when the monarchy was restored in Spain after the Franco years, people in Switzerland were incredulous at such a retrograde and ridiculous act so is the situation in Georgia any different? Well, possibly it is different. Now we can also see the not very happy effects of presidential style government. The USA is perhaps a good example of how it really seems to go into the wrong direction, totally the wrong direction. And possibly, I can imagine somehow in Georgia, whether it's also something to do with the whole geographical situation, even if you like, the landscape plays a role in that. I can imagine that it could suit Georgia again, and I think the only precondition would have to be the king would have to be someone of utter integrity, truly acting for the ultimate interests of the nation, as a guardian of those ultimate interests. I think it could work, actually.
Thank you. 1991 წლის იანვარში რეიგანი პრეზიდენტის მოვალეობის შესრულებას შეუდგა think tank-თა დიდი ხელშეწყობით. როგორც გვახსოვს, ამ თანამშრომლობამ გაამართლა და მოგვიანებით რეიგანომიკად წოდებულმა ეკონომიკურმა კურსმა ეს უზარმაზარი ქვეყანა წელში გამართა. მას შემდეგ ლამის ნახევარი საუკუნე გავიდა. ხოლმე დადგა დრო ხელისუფლებები უფრო მეტად ითვალისწინებდნენ მეცნიერულ აზრს, თანამშრომლობდნენ ცნობილ მეცნიერებთან, მის წარმომადგენლებთან, კვლევით ინსტიტუტებთან, იზიარებდნენ მათ აზრს, რჩევებს, ყურადღებით ეკიდებოდნენ და ასეთ მყარ საფუძველზე მართავდნენ ქვეყანას. როგორც ვიცით, ინგლისსა და ამერიკაში მეტნაკლებად მოგვარებულია ეს საკითხი, დიდწივა და ასეც არის. ჩვენს ქართულ რეალობაზე რა სიტყვით?
Well, it sounds, of course, very good. We live in an age of technology and in which science would seem to be very important. But in a way, it also goes back to this question of the philosopher king. And it sounds very good if attention is paid to the scientists and researchers. But can it really work in the way that one imagines it might be able to work? Well, in a way, collaboration with scientists is incompatible with the scientists staying away from politics. And I remember that, for example, the head of our chemistry department became the government chief scientist, and he had to oversee, this was in the time of some big public health problems, the bovine spongiform encephalopathy, in particular the so-called mad cow disease. And the policy that was enacted was actually wholly inappropriate. It was vastly expensive and almost completely ineffectual. And of course, this was not the field of expertise of this man who was the chief scientist at the time. We saw it again in the time of COVID, that we had chief scientists who really, in the end, gave his approval to policies that were actually inappropriate, were scientifically indefensible. And the problem is that in that position, it is extraordinarily difficult to follow that quality of a scientist, which Richard Feynman has very eloquently written about, the quality of integrity. A scientist has to look at all sides of an argument, both those for what he thinks, or he or she thinks might be the right thing, and against. And that one side cannot be neglected at the expense of the other. Very unlike the mentality of the lawyer, of course, who quite happily marshals only those arguments favourable to his or her side of the case. Because in the court of law, it can be assumed that the other side will take up the other side of the case and bring the other evidence. But the scientist has to, if the scientist is to retain integrity, the scientist must look at all sides of the case. And this was only too clearly not done in the COVID pandemic, for example, that one particular line of thinking was followed, and to the woeful neglect of alternative approaches, and consideration of these alternative approaches could have led to a more sensible outcome. So the plain answer is really no. That doesn't seem to lead to a better policy. In fact, many people were then criticizing criticizing policy during COVID by saying too much attention had been given to the scientists. Unfortunately, those scientists were not acting with integrity and were not giving us the whole picture, which, for the reason I mentioned, is really inevitable in such a position. But the problem really goes far deeper than that. The problem really goes back to those two cultures about which C.P. Snow gave a very famous lecture. The Two Cultures, it was the name. The Reed lecture was around 1960. And strangely enough, I've been thinking about that again quite recently, and it seems we do very much still have these two cultures. So the problem is, even if the scientist gives advice, the politicians are so ill-versed in matters scientific that they are incapable of receiving that advice. They can only receive it yes or no. They can accept it without any kind of criticism, or they can reject it on some kind of gut instinct. What they are incapable of doing is properly appraising it as on its merits, something which, of course, the scientists should have anyway done, following scientific integrity. But given that that was not done, the only possible chance of return to sanity, as it were, would have been if the politicians would have had the confidence to criticize what was being offered to them by way of advice. But because of the continuing and very regrettable existence of this gulf between the two cultures, the humanities and the sciences, they were incapable of doing that. So that remains, in our own time, now, it remains a very urgent task to try and bridge these two cultures. We very much need the humanities to have some acquaintance with the sciences, just like, of course, we want the sciences to be acquainted with the humanities as well. But as C.P. Snow remarked in his lecture, I have on occasions at gatherings, social gatherings, I've asked someone to tell me what is the second law of thermodynamics, which is the scientific equivalent of asking someone what are the works of Shakespeare, what is the most famous play of Shakespeare, if you like. This question about the second law of thermodynamics generally raised indifference or even hostility. And he went on then to extend the experiment to ask things like what is pressure, what is even more basic scientific notions. And this is the scientific equivalent of asking someone, can you read? Unfortunately, and my experience corroborates it, most non-scientists cannot give a coherent answer to the question, what is pressure, for example, let alone what is the second law of thermodynamics. So we still have an enormous lot of work to do. So this is what the scientists should somehow strive to bring about, this bridging of the two cultures, to acquaint those in the humanities with some of the fundamental tenets of science.
ფუნდამენტურ მეცნიერებათა ხვედრი ზოგადად 21 საუკუნეში ხომ არ დააკმაყოფილა მათი მნიშვნელობა და პრესტიჟი პრაგმატულმა ეპოქამ, როცა უმთავრესი მოთხოვნა დღესვე ახლავე დაიდოს შედეგი, რაც უმეტესად მატერიალურ მოგებას გულისხმობს. როგორც ცნობილია, ფუნდამენტურ მეცნიერებაში წლები, ათეული წლებია საჭირო, რომ იქეთ დააფინანსოს მეცნიერება, ვიდრე შედეგს მიიღებდეთ. ასე პირდაპირ შედეგი თეორიულადაც კი დაუშვებელია, ხომ? პირიქით ძვირი ფუფუნებაა ფუნდამენტური მეცნიერება და მისი, მაგრამ პრესტიჟულია ნებისმიერი თანაუყარე ქვეყნისთვის. თქვენ წინა ინტერვიუში ბრძანეთ, რომ ინგლისში 2023 წლის იანვრიდან არსებობს მოწინავე კვლევებისა და გამოგონებების სააგენტო ARIA, სხვაც არაერთი სამთავრობო სააგენტო, და რომ ბრიტანეთის მთავრობა მზადაა ყოველწლიურად 20,000 მილიონი გილვანქა სტერლინგით დააფინანსოს ეროვნული მეცნიერება. ასე რომ შეიძლება ითქვას, ეს პრობლემა საკმაოდ მოგვარებული გაქვთ. საქართველოში მეტნაკლები წარმატებით ფუნქციონირებს თქვენთვის კარგად ნაცნობი რუსთაველის ფონდი, რომელსაც ხელისუფლება საკმაოდ ხელს უწყობს და ეხმარება, მაგრამ ეს პრობლემის გადაჭრას მაინც არ შველის და უამრავი პრობლემაა ჩვენთან მეცნიერების განვითარების თვალსაზრისით. ხომ არაა მოსალოდნელი, რომ ბრიტანეთში ხელისუფლების შეცვლამ რაიმე გავლენა იქონიოს მეცნიერების ფინანსურ მხარდაჭერაზე, როგორც ცნობილი გახდა, სამხედრო დაფინანსების მნიშვნელოვნად შემცირებას აპირებენ. ხომ არ გავრცელდება ეს მეცნიერებაზეც? ხომ არ არის ამის საშიშროება?
Well, there was a lot of excitement when the new government was elected, and everyone felt it could hardly be worse than the old one. And maybe it's still too early to tell. And I hadn't heard anything about defence cuts. Maybe I just missed that news, but I do remember when my father he was working on rockets for the then British space program, and to his profound regret, this program was actually scrapped, despite having been very successful. And the work was diverted into missiles for defence systems. And so defence tends to have been prioritised over basic science, as it were. But we did have, under the previous government, as you mentioned, we had this initiative, which I don't know if it will be followed, but this astonishing sum, 20,000 million pounds annually for science in over the next few years, each year, that sum to be spent on science, which sounds excellent. But the question is, how will it be spent? Now, I was struck just a couple of days ago, the Secretary of State for Health made an announcement about a new blood test for cancer, which has been developed in one or more university laboratories in England. But it struck me, why is the government interfering in science? Why is it just choosing to mention these few laboratories, one or few laboratories, because there are dozens of laboratories working on this problem, and they probably all of them are doing very worthy work. They're all worthy of support. What seems to be necessary to avoid at all costs is this interference, this bureaucratic interference in the work of the scientists. Now, I calculated that there are about 10,000 full professors in engineering and science in England. And so if you gave this 20,000 million pounds to these 10,000 professors, you just divided it equally among them to be spent as they thought fit. That would be £2 million each year, which would be a significant sum, and they could no doubt do a great deal of useful work with this. Could be used to fund doctoral students or buy equipment or use in collaboration with other laboratories and so on. This would be a highly democratic way of financing science. No doubt some of these, some of the money would result in failed projects, but one has to fail. Remember, I think it was Thomas J. Watson who when asked how to increase the rate of progress, he said, double your failure rate. There's a lot of truth in that. And to become a full professor in England is no easy thing. One has to go through many degrees of selection, apart from the initial selection of getting your university place, passing your degrees, your higher degrees and so on, and then getting appointment, getting your faculty position and so on. So these are not nobodies, the people in these posts. They are fully, I would say, fully worthy of and entitled to receive this sum to spend on science. But unless something like that is done, I do not have very strong hopes for the efforts to revive or increase the importance of science. Of course, the pure science is only part of the story. One also needs people, commercial side, investors, to spot promising products that could be brought to market and invest in them, put their money in them. And mostly, investment in science is incredibly rewarding, yields very high returns of hundreds or thousands of %. So it looks to be a very worthwhile investment. The trouble is that there are also opportunities in parallel, mainly in land and development, which can offer returns of tens of thousands or even 1,000,000 %. There was a recent very prominent case in the north of England, in the Tees Works, the biggest development site in Europe. The return on the investment from a group of entrepreneurs who bought some land very cheaply and then resold it and redeveloped it was something like 1,000,000 %. So of course science cannot compete with that. So what we need is a combination of an equitable distribution of resources without bureaucracy among those who are already qualified to spend the money, and then closing those pathways that divert so much valuable resources away from where it could be spent in improving science and technology and applying science and technology.
მედიის ეწოდება მეოთხე ხელისუფლება ინგლისური წარმომავლობისაა. როგორც ცნობილია, ინგლისელმა პარლამენტარმა ედმუნდ ბერკმა გამოიტანა პირველად ეს მეტაფორა ჟურნალისტების მისამართი ჯერ კიდევ 18 საუკუნეში. მას შემდეგ ჟურნალისტები სულ ვამაყობთ ამ ხელის ეწოდებით და ვცდილობთ, რომ ვცდილობდით ყოველ შემთხვევაში ყოფილიყავით შესაბამისები ამ ზეწოდებისა. დღევანდელი მედია საქართველოში დიდწილად დაშორდა ამ პრესტიჟულ შეფასებას. ინგლისში როგორაა ჟურნალისტების საქმე?
Well, this is also, of course, a very pertinent issue, and I have to say that the present outlook does not look too favourable to me. I remember quite a long time ago, probably more than 10 years, it may have been 20 years ago even, a literary friend of mine remarking that he thought journalists were among the leading intellectuals of the day. Actually, they really were at the cutting edge of thought, and perhaps at that time he was right. But nowadays we have seen we have a very different picture. I actually very symptomatic was the resignation about 2 years ago of the distinguished journalist Peter Oborne from the Daily Telegraph because of the loss of editorial integrity of the paper. And the Daily Telegraph used to be one of the quality newspapers, but I scarcely think that it fulfills that role nowadays. But we see everywhere the same decline. Perhaps the best daily paper in England is the Financial Times, but it's actually owned by a Japanese company nowadays. And on the continent, the same. Some of the best titles have simply disappeared. When I was studying in Lausanne, we had the admirable Gazette de Lausanne, which must have had a fairly small circulation because it really was centered on the city of Lausanne and the surrounding areas. But an amazingly high quality of journalism. And then we have the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, probably still the best quality German language newspaper, but again, I do not think it has the quality that it used to have 10 or even 20 years ago, alas. I used to regularly read it just for its science columns. They were so informative that it actually saved me having to read the journals in some areas of science. But it has not got the strength today as it had. So, alas, I do not think journalism does have the same prestige and quality that it used to have. In a way, it boils down to integrity. These journalists used to dig out every facet of the story. It's a bit like the scientists and the scientists' integrity. They tried to find out every aspect of the story, not just one side of it. That is the trap in which it seems to me many journalists today fall when you read the newspapers, and as a result, the newspapers are not even terribly interesting to read anymore because they lack this roundedness, this integrity of exposition that used to be omnipresent in the best quality newspapers. So I don't know here what the solution is. Of course, there's such great competition now from social media, blogs, any kind of internet-based material. I don't know the answer, but I do very firmly have the impression that the quality of journalism today is less high than it used to be, regrettably so.
Thank you so much. დიდი მადლობა საინტერესო საუბრისათვის და სტუდიაში სტუმრობისათვის. მომავალ შეხვედრამდე.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here.
მომავალ ხუთშაბათამდე გემშვიდობებით ჩემო ძვირფასო ტელემაყურებელს.